It was a hot afternoon at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The hustle and bustle of the terminal was almost ordinary passengers rushing past. The rhythmic sound of rolling luggage, and the faint murmur of announcements echoing through the loudspeakers. In the midst of it all, Jamal Turner walked briskly toward his gate. At 16, he had grown accustomed to moving through the world with a quiet determination. But today, there was a weight in the air. His first solo trip. His first chance to prove himself on a national stage. Jamal wasn't nervous about flying. He had taken plenty of flights before, often with his parents or his older sister. But this time, things were different. This trip was about more than just a flight. It was a chance to prove to himself and to everyone else that he had what it took to succeed. In just a few hours, he would land in Chicago, where he would compete in the national chess tournament. For someone like Jamal, a full scholarship to a prestigious college was within reach if he could just play his best. It was a golden opportunity, the kind that didn't come often, and he couldn't afford to let it slip away. With his backpack over his shoulder and a chessboard tucked under his arm, Jamal boarded the plane. The sounds of the busy terminal faded as he stepped into the cool, quiet cabin. He found his seat, an aisle seat near the front, and settled in. The seat next to him was empty, and in that small, unspoken space, Jamal allowed himself a brief moment of relaxation, a moment to think, perhaps even to prepare. The chessboard in his bag felt heavier than usual. There was a lot riding on this. The flight attendant, a tall woman with stern features, seemed to look him over as he walked down the aisle. There was nothing particularly unusual about her glance, but Jamal noticed it. He always noticed these things the way people looked at him, especially when they didn't think he was looking. It wasn't anything overt, but it was there, that little shift in the air, a slight hesitation, a quiet judgment. He had seen it before, countless times, in stores, in classrooms, in public spaces. It was the kind of thing you couldn't always explain but couldn't ignore either. He sat down, arranging his things, and tried to focus on the tournament ahead. His chest tightened slightly, but he brushed the feeling aside. This was important. The tournament was important. He would be the first in his family to go to college, to earn that scholarship, and this was his moment to make it happen. As the plane began to fill with passengers, Jamal's gaze drifted toward the empty seat beside him. The thought occurred to him that it would be a lot easier to study his chess notes if he had a bit more space. He looked up at the flight attendant, who was now standing nearby. "Excuse me," Jamal said, his voice polite but firm. "May I switch seats? The one next to me is empty, and I'd like a little more space to study." The attendant paused, her gaze cold and calculated as she looked him over. She didn't smile, didn't even nod. Her eyes moved over him briefly, then back to the empty seat. "That seat is not available for you," she said, her voice flat, almost dismissive. Jamal's brow furrowed in surprise. He hadn't expected such a blunt refusal, especially over something so small. But he nodded anyway, not wanting to make a scene. He turned back to his seat and adjusted his things. There was a subtle discomfort in the air now, something just a bit off. But he couldn't place it. Still, he tried to push it from his mind. It wasn't worth making a fuss. The plane's engines hummed to life as the flight attendant moved down the aisle, checking the safety of passengers. Jamal shifted in his seat, trying to get comfortable, but the growing unease remained. It wasn't the cramped space. It wasn't even the flight attendant's cold demeanor. It was something else, something he had felt before but couldn't fully explain. It was the feeling that, somehow, things were always a little harder for him, always a little more complicated. And maybe that's just how the world worked. The announcement for takeoff came over the speakers, and the cabin grew quieter. But Jamal's thoughts were still tangled. The airport, the flight, the competition, they all blurred into one long line of moments, each one adding a bit more pressure. He was used to it, though. He had to be. In his world, nothing came easy. Not the scholarship, not the respect, and not even the simple courtesy of a little extra space on a plane. He was about to close his eyes, to calm his mind for the journey ahead, when the flight attendant returned. This time, she was standing at the end of the aisle, staring directly at him. Her expression had shifted. There was no warmth, no subtlety, just cold command. "You need to get off the plane," she said, her tone final, without explanation. Jamal froze. His heart began to beat faster. His mind racing with disbelief. What? He glanced around, the eyes of the other passengers turning toward him. The world seemed to tilt slightly. The weight of their gazes heavy on his shoulders. "I'm just sitting here," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." The attendant's eyes narrowed. "You're causing problems. We can't take off with you on board." Her words hung in the air, loud enough for others to hear. Jamal felt his face flush with a mix of shock and humiliation. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears now, a dull thumping that drowned out the murmurs of the passengers. With a deep breath, he stood up, gathering his things. His mind raced, but there was something else. Too, a strange sense of resignation. This wasn't the first time he had felt this way. It wouldn't be the last. The story of his life, of anyone who looked like him, was filled with these small, seemingly insignificant moments. The moments that, in their own quiet way, chipped away at your sense of belonging, at your right to take up space. As Jamal made his way down the aisle, the flight attendant's gaze didn't waver. Neither did the eyes of the other passengers. There was no apology, no offer of explanation, just the sound of his footsteps, echoing in his ears, as he walked off the plane. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of it all was in the silence, in the quiet understanding that things were never quite as simple as they seemed. Jamal sat in the terminal, his backpack slung over his shoulder and his chessboard nestled carefully in his bag. The airport was a familiar place to him. He had spent hours there before, waiting, observing, watching the ebb and flow of passengers as they moved through the space. But this time, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that he couldn't shake off. Despite the hum of conversations and the clang of rolling luggage, it wasn't the crowd. It wasn't the heat of the day. It was something deeper, more elusive, something Jamal had grown accustomed to over the years, but never quite gotten used to. It was the subtle glance, the unspoken question, the quiet assumption that had always lingered just beneath the surface. He wasn't sure if the others saw it too, or if it was just him. But he had learned to notice. He always noticed. His mind drifted back to the moment he had been asked to leave the plane. The words of the flight attendant echoed in his ears, as clear as they had been the first time. "You need to get off the plane." He had told himself to stay calm, not to let his frustration show. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply asked for a little more space to study. But the way she had looked at him, the way her voice had hardened, was something Jamal knew all too well. People didn't always say it out loud, but they showed it in their actions. The way they moved around him, the way they looked past him, or sometimes straight through him. It was the same feeling he had gotten countless times when he was walking through a store, when he was sitting in a classroom, when he was just trying to exist in a world that often didn't seem to want him there. It wasn't a hatred that screamed in your face, but a quiet dismissal that slowly ate away at your sense of belonging. Jamal sighed and leaned back against the cold terminal seat. His fingers brushed the edge of his chessboard as he opened his bag. He had to focus. This tournament wasn't just a game for him. It was the chance to change his life. A full scholarship to a good college was more than just a dream. It was the only way he could make a better future for himself. But now, everything felt distant. The tournament, the scholarship, even the chessboard in his hands. All of it seemed like it was happening in another world. A world that felt a little further out of reach after what had just happened. He had been kicked off the plane. No explanation, no apology, just a harsh command and the feeling of everyone's eyes on him as he walked down the aisle. Head down, heart pounding. It was a small moment in the grand scheme of things. People got kicked off planes all the time for all sorts of reasons. But this wasn't about being a troublemaker or even breaking any rules. This was about something else. Something that was harder to name. And Jamal knew that it was something that wouldn't be fixed with just a simple apology or a change of seat. The problem ran deeper than that. He glanced up at the clock. He had been sitting there for what felt like hours. But it had only been a few minutes. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. It was a message from his friend Marcus. one of the few people who understood the weight of the world on Jamal's shoulders. Yo, you good? I saw what happened. Let me know if you need anything. We've got your back. Jamal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and stared at the screen. The message wasn't a surprise. Marcus and his friends had always been there, supporting him in ways they didn't even fully understand. It wasn't just about the game. It was about surviving in a world that was sometimes indifferent, sometimes even cruel. But now, Jamal's mind was already racing. His thoughts had begun to take on a new urgency. He could feel the injustice in his chest, a knot tightening every time he replayed the scene in his mind. The unfairness, the way he had been dismissed so casually, as though his presence on that plane was an inconvenience. He knew he had to do something. He wasn't sure exactly what, but he knew that if he didn't speak up, it would be as though it had never happened, as though it had been normal. And Jamal couldn't let that happen. Not this time. He pulled out his phone, unlocking the screen with a quick swipe. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, unsure of what to say. There were so many things running through his mind, so many things he wanted to express. But what would make people listen? What would make them understand? Finally, he began typing, his thoughts flowing faster than his fingers could keep up. Just got kicked off a flight at JFK for no reason. The flight attendant accused me of causing problems just for asking to switch seats. This is racism, plain and simple. Hashtag justice for Jamal. Jamal paused after pressing send. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't know if it would go anywhere, if anyone would even care. But there was something in him that told him this was the right thing to do. The notification from Twitter popped up almost immediately. A like, then another, and another. Jamal watched as the numbers began to grow. It wasn't much yet, but the fact that people were reacting, that they were paying attention, made something inside him shift. He could hear the voices of the people who had supported him over the years. The ones who had always stood by him when things were difficult. This wasn't just his fight. It was everyone's fight. And somehow, in this small moment, it was beginning to feel like he wasn't alone. But there was still a long way to go. As Jamal leaned back in his seat, watching the growing stream of notifications, he knew that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a while, he felt like he might actually have a chance to win. Jamal sat still in the terminal, the buzz of the airport swirling around him, distant and muted, like the sound of water rushing in the background. His bag sat at his feet, his chessboard packed securely inside. But there was no longer any desire to reach for it. The tournament, the scholarship, everything had suddenly felt far away, as if it no longer mattered. It was hard to focus on anything other than the image of the flight attendant's stern face, the coldness in her voice, and the humiliation that had followed. It wasn't just being asked to leave the plane that lingered in his mind. It wasn't even the harshness with which she had spoken, her words sharp and final. What stuck with him was the feeling that had settled in his chest. Quiet but unshakable. The feeling that he had done something wrong. That, somehow, the world had decided he didn't belong. Jamal had been aware of these feelings for years. But today, they had taken on a new weight. They were no longer just moments of discomfort he could brush off. This was different. This wasn't a fleeting glance from a stranger or the subtle way people avoided him in a crowd. This was more direct. More overt. It was a deliberate rejection. A statement that his presence, his very being, was unwelcome in certain spaces. His mind drifted back to the moment when the flight attendant had told him to leave. The way her eyes had studied him. The quick dismissal. The lack of reason. Her words had been like the flick of a switch, turning the quiet discomfort he had felt into something much darker. You need to get off the plane. There had been no apology. No attempt to explain. She hadn't even offered a polite reason. She had simply made a decision. One that was unquestionable. And for a brief moment, as he gathered his things and walked down the aisle, it felt as though the whole world was watching him. The eyes of the passengers. The low murmur of their voices. It was as if they were all silently confirming that his removal was justified. And in that moment, Jamal had believed it too. The walk down the aisle had felt long, despite how short it actually was. His movements had been stiff, each step dragging, as though the weight of the moment was pushing against him. The plane, once full of chatter and anticipation, had grown unnervingly quiet. Even the sounds of the engines seemed to fade, as if they had been swallowed by the tension in the air. As he reached the door, he hadn't looked back. There was no reason to. He knew what they were thinking. He could feel it in their eyes. Sitting in the terminal now, Jamal struggled to push the thoughts away. But they kept coming back, one after another. How had it come to this? How had a simple request to change seats, something that countless passengers had likely done without a second thought, turned into this? It didn't make sense. It felt unfair. But in his gut, Jamal knew that the problem ran deeper than one flight attendant's actions. It was a problem that stretched back long before today. A problem that had existed for as long as he could remember. Jamal had always known that the world treated him differently. It wasn't something people said outright. But he felt it in the way people looked at him. In the way they spoke to him. In the way they made assumptions about who he was. Simply because of the color of his skin. It wasn't something anyone talked about directly. But it was there, lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. It was in the way people would cross the street when they saw him walking toward them. In the way teachers would call on him last, even when he knew the answer. In the way store clerks would watch him more closely than anyone else. The feeling wasn't new, but today, it had felt more real than ever. Jamal didn't need anyone to tell him that this was about race. He knew it, the way the flight attendant had looked at him. The way she had spoken to him, it was the same feeling he had gotten many times before. The sense that he didn't belong. That he was somehow different. He shook his head and pulled out his phone. The notifications were coming in faster now. A steady stream of messages from his friends. His family. Even strangers who had seen the tweet. His heart pounded as he read each one. "We've got your back, Jamal. This isn't right. Keep fighting. You're not alone. You're doing the right thing." At first, it had felt strange to share what had happened. He had always kept his thoughts to himself. Always chosen to remain quiet. To avoid drawing attention to the small injustices he had faced throughout his life. But this was different. This wasn't a small injustice. This was something that could no longer be ignored. He typed out a quick response to Marcus. "Thanks for the support. I'll figure it out." But deep down, Jamal wasn't sure what he could do. What could he do in the face of something so ingrained, so entrenched in the very fabric of everyday life? Could a tweet really change anything? Could one boy's story be enough to make people understand? The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes as Jamal sat in the terminal. Lost in thought. He had no clear answers. No grand plan. But he knew this. He couldn't just let it go. This wasn't something he could ignore. Not now. Not anymore. There was a quiet resolve that settled within him. The situation was bigger than him. Bigger than any one person. But if there was one thing Jamal had learned from years of chess, it was this: in every game, no matter how difficult, there was always a way to turn things around. Sometimes, it wasn't about winning outright. Sometimes, it was about making sure your opponent knew they had been beaten. Jamal took a deep breath, glanced at the clock again, and stood up. The tournament was still ahead. The scholarship still in sight. But now, something else had entered the equation. His fight for justice had just begun. And this time, he wouldn't be the one quietly stepping aside. Jamal sat quietly in the terminal. The steady hum of the airport a backdrop to his thoughts. The initial rush of anger had subsided, replaced now by a strange clarity. It was as if the moment the flight attendant had spoken, he had been thrust into a new kind of awareness. The injustice wasn't just about being removed from the plane, it was the culmination of years of subtle, unnoticed wrongs, small slights that built up over time, each one feeding into a narrative that Jamal could no longer ignore. He could feel it in his bones now. The system wasn't broken. It was working just as it was meant to. The thought unsettled him, but rather than turning away from it, Jamal leaned into that discomfort. For the first time in a long while, he saw things as they were. And he realized that this moment, the moment where he had been cast aside, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. He pulled out his phone once more, the steady stream of notifications still blinking at the corner of the screen. At first, He had hesitated to write anything. There had been so many times when speaking up only seemed to make things worse. But now, the words came more easily, more confidently. Just got kicked off a flight at JFK. The flight attendant accused me of causing problems. Just for asking to switch seats. This is racism. Plain and simple. #justice for Jamal. He hit send, his fingers lingering on the screen for a moment. As though waiting for some sign. Some feeling that this would make a difference. The seconds ticked by. Then the phone buzzed. A like. A retweet. Then more. Comments began to appear faster than Jamal could read them. Some of them were from friends. People who had known him for years. Others, from complete strangers. Their messages filled with words of support. Words of anger. People were listening. And somehow, that small, quiet act of sharing his story made him feel less alone. For years, Jamal had internalized the idea that his voice didn't matter. That his experiences, however painful or unsettling, were just a part of the background noise of life. After all, who was going to listen? But now, as the messages piled up, as the hashtag began to take on a life of its own, something began to shift. It wasn't that he was looking for sympathy. It wasn't that he wanted to be the center of attention. What Jamal wanted, what he needed, was for people to see the truth of what had happened. To understand that what he had experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue. A deep-seated problem that no one wanted to talk about. He had always known the world saw him differently. He had felt it in the way people looked at him when he walked down the street. In the way teachers would speak to him. In the way strangers would avoid eye contact in stores. But today, something had shifted. Jamal wasn't just another teenager caught up in the everyday routine of life. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was someone, and his experience was valid. The tweet quickly gained traction, with more people joining the conversation. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was Marcus, his friend from the chess club, who had seen the tweet and shared it with his followers. "Man, you're trending. This is huge. Let me know if you need anything." Jamal took a deep breath. He hadn't expected things to move this quickly. He didn't know what he had hoped for. But now the speed of it all was almost overwhelming. He didn't know what would happen next. Would the airline respond? Would the flight attendant be held accountable? Would anything change at all? But for now, Jamal focused on one thing: keeping the momentum going. He had to make sure this didn't fizzle out, like so many other issues had before. It wasn't enough to just post about what had happened. He had to make people understand that this was part of a larger pattern. A daily reality that so many people, especially Black people, faced every single day. Jamal didn't know if his post would result in any real change. He didn't know if the airline would issue an apology or if anyone in power would take the time to listen. But for the first time, he understood that change didn't come from silence. It didn't come from passivity. It came from speaking up. From forcing the conversation to happen even when it felt uncomfortable. Across the terminal, Jamal saw the faces of other passengers who had witnessed the incident. Some of them looking at their phones. Some of them still glancing around uneasily. A few of them had begun to share their own thoughts online. Some in support, others still questioning what had actually happened. The tension in the air was palpable. The once casual atmosphere now charged with uncertainty. Jamal didn't mind. He had done what he needed to do. He had spoken his truth. And now the world would have to listen. As his phone continued to buzz with notifications, Jamal couldn't help but feel a strange sense of control. He wasn't the passive recipient of this injustice anymore. He was part of the conversation now. A voice that would be heard. Even if it was only one tweet at a time. And that was enough. For now, the notifications on Jamal's phone were relentless. A steady stream of likes, retweets, and comments. At first, he'd read each one carefully, trying to absorb the weight of what was happening. But soon, it became overwhelming. The words blurred together, and he found himself scrolling aimlessly, barely registering what he was seeing. Some of the messages were supportive, urging him to keep going, to keep pushing for justice. Others were more skeptical, questioning his version of events, asking if he had really done anything to provoke the flight attendant. Jamal didn't have answers for those questions. He didn't know what had led her to treat him the way she had. He hadn't done anything that would have warranted being kicked off a plane. All he had done was ask for a little more space to study. But that wasn't the part of the story that mattered anymore. What mattered now was the truth of what had happened, and what it said about the way people like Jamal were treated in a world that too often overlooked them. The subtle prejudice, the quiet assumptions, the everyday dismissals, they had all come together in that one moment. And now, the conversation was starting to spread. It wasn't just his voice anymore. It was the collective voice of everyone who had ever been made to feel small. To feel invisible. He sat in the terminal, watching the people around him. Some were busy with their own lives, lost in their phones or their books. Others were glancing at him now and then, eyes narrowing as they saw his post and began to form their own opinions. The tension in the air had shifted. No one was openly confrontational, but there was an underlying sense of unease. For the first time, Jamal felt the weight of his actions not just as a personal statement, but as a ripple in the broader currents of the world. Jamal's tweet had gone viral, and with it came a wave of attention that he wasn't sure he was ready for. Local reporters had started reaching out, asking for interviews, requesting more details. News outlets had picked up the story, and the hashtag justice for Jamal had begun trending. But with that attention came scrutiny. The airline had yet to make a public statement, but Jamal could feel the pressure mounting. People were demanding answers, demanding accountability. It was strange. In a way, Jamal hadn't asked for any of this. He had simply shared what had happened, not expecting anything to come from it. But now that the story was out there, now that it was becoming a symbol of something larger, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and apprehension. Pride, because he had spoken up and made people listen. Apprehension, because he knew what was coming next. He had seen it before, how quickly the narrative could shift. How quickly support could turn into backlash. It was always easier to dismiss a problem when it was distant, when it wasn't right in front of you. But when the problem couldn't be ignored any longer, people began to find ways to explain it away, to diminish it. Some people were already doing that. The comments on his post weren't all supportive. Some asked why he hadn't just complied with the flight attendant's request. Others said he was overreacting, that it wasn't a big deal. They called it an isolated incident, something that wasn't worth making a fuss over. He knew these arguments. He had heard them before. From teachers, from classmates, from people who couldn't understand why certain things bothered him. It was the same argument he had heard growing up, that small acts of discrimination weren't worth fighting for, that it was better to let things go, to move on, to not make waves. But Jamal had never been good at ignoring the waves. He had spent too many years learning to read the undercurrents, feeling the way they tugged at him, threatening to pull him under. And today, he was no longer willing to let them pass unnoticed. Across the terminal, he saw a group of passengers talking in hushed voices. Some of them were staring at their phones, no doubt reading the same articles he had seen. Jamal couldn't hear their words, but he could feel the shift in the air. They were all part of the same unfolding story now. The flight attendant's behavior, the airline's silence. It was no longer just about Jamal. It was about something much bigger. It was about the everyday injustices that many people like him faced. Things that were often dismissed as small, insignificant moments. The quiet glances, the subtle dismissals, the way people were treated as though they were less than. It all added up, and for once, it was being seen. Jamal glanced at his phone again. Another notification. A new message, this time from his mother. "I'm proud of you, Jamal, but please be careful. You've stirred the pot now." It's not always easy when people start paying attention to things like this. Her words hit him differently than they had before. His mother had always been the calm one, the one who told him to stay quiet and keep his head down. But this time, there was something else in her message. A recognition of the risks that came with speaking out, but also a quiet approval of what he was doing. It wasn't that she wanted him to face this, but that she knew he was no longer willing to stay silent. Jamal sighed and set the phone down, leaning back in his seat. The airport was the same as it had always been, busy, noisy, filled with people heading in different directions. But now, it felt different to him. There was a weight to the air, a sense of something shifting beneath the surface. He wasn't sure where this would go. He didn't know if the airline would apologize, if the flight attendant would face any consequences, if things would really change. But he did know this: the conversation had started, and it wasn't going to end quietly. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt as though he was standing at the center of something important. Something that mattered, and even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was difficult, he wasn't about to walk away from it. The conversation had begun, and now, it was up to all of them to see where it would lead. Jamal sat quietly in the terminal, his eyes fixed on the screen of his phone. The messages kept coming, a steady stream that he had long since stopped trying to keep up with. His tweet had gone viral. The hashtag justice for Jamal was trending. News outlets were picking up the story. Reporters had started reaching out, asking for interviews, for details he wasn't sure how to give. There was a sense of disbelief in the air, but also something else, something heavier. His phone buzzed again, another notification. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the screen rest in his hands, absorbing the weight of everything that had happened. The small injustices he had lived with every day had suddenly been brought into the light. And now, they could no longer be ignored. There was no going back. The flight attendant's actions, the way she had treated him without cause, were no longer just his personal experience. They had become a symbol, a representation of something larger, something that people were now paying attention to. Jamal glanced around the terminal. It was still busy. The usual bustle of travelers moving to and fro, the sound of rolling luggage and overhead announcements filling the air. But everything felt different now. There was a tension in the atmosphere, a quiet unease that hung over everything. People weren't looking at him the same way anymore. They had noticed. They were thinking about what had happened, weighing it in their minds, even if they hadn't said anything aloud. Some of the passengers who had been on the flight were still here, scattered throughout the terminal. Jamal saw them occasionally, catching their eyes as they glanced at him, unsure of what to say or whether to approach. They had all been witnesses, though none of them had truly understood what was happening at the time. But now, the words he had written, words that had once felt like a simple truth, had taken on a life of their own. People were asking questions, and those questions were being heard. A few minutes later, a representative from the airline appeared, walking briskly toward Jamal. The man was in his mid-40s, dressed in a neat suit, his face trying to appear calm, though the tension in his posture betrayed him. He stopped a few feet away, offering a polite, but strained smile. "Mr. Turner," the man began, his voice careful, as if measuring each word. "We are deeply sorry for what happened. We are investigating the situation, and we will do everything in our power to resolve this. Please accept our sincerest apologies, and let us arrange for you to be put on the next available flight to Chicago. All expenses will be covered." Jamal didn't immediately respond. His gaze lingered on the man, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the situation in a way he hadn't fully allowed himself to before. The man's words were smooth, practiced, and Jamal could tell they were not coming from a place of genuine remorse. They were the words of someone who had been trained to deliver apologies, to offer solutions, to make the situation go away as quickly as possible. "I'm sure you're sorry," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "But this isn't just about the next flight, is it? You don't get to apologize and pretend this didn't happen. It's about what happened before. The way I was treated. The way I was dismissed without reason. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a pattern." The airline representative looked taken aback, his carefully composed face flickering with uncertainty. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jamal continued before he could respond. "You can offer me a flight. You can offer me compensation. But that doesn't change what happened. That doesn't change the fact that I was kicked off the plane for no reason other than who I am. For no reason other than the color of my skin. And now everyone knows it." The representative stood there for a moment, silence stretching between them. He seemed to be weighing his options, searching for a response that would appease Jamal, that would end the conversation on a positive note. But Jamal wasn't looking for reassurance or empty apologies. He had been through enough of those to know they didn't mean anything. Finally, the representative cleared his throat and nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I understand, Mr. Turner, and I assure you, We are taking this matter seriously. The flight attendant involved has been suspended pending review. And we are conducting a full internal investigation. Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, his heart still heavy with a sense of something unresolved. The words were what Jamal had expected. And yet they did little to quiet the storm inside him. There was a certain finality to them. As though the matter would soon be closed. Forgotten. Swept away into the past. He didn't want that. This wasn't just about one flight. It wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger. What happens next? Jamal asked, his voice softer now, but with a quiet intensity. How do you make sure this doesn't happen again? How do you make sure it doesn't happen to someone else? The representative hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. We will address it, Mr. Turner. I can assure you of that. But Jamal wasn't sure he believed him. Not fully. There were too many questions left unanswered. Too many stories that had been ignored for far too long. He had been a part of this system for his whole life. Watching from the sidelines as others spoke of change. As others promised progress. But Jamal had seen it all before, the way things moved in circles. How the same patterns repeated themselves. And how the real change never quite came. And so, he remained silent. He didn't need to hear the empty reassurances. He didn't need to be placated. What he needed, what the world needed, was a real shift. And that wasn't something that could be fixed with a flight or a press release. Thank you, Jamal said, standing up slowly, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. But I'll make my own arrangements. The representative didn't protest. He simply nodded, his face unreadable as Jamal turned and walked away. The tension in the terminal was still there. But now, it was something Jamal could carry with him. It was a constant reminder that things could no longer be swept under the rug. No matter how hard people tried to ignore the truth. Jamal didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if this would change anything. If it would lead to any lasting change. But what he did know was that he had spoken up. And the conversation had started. And no matter how uncomfortable it might make people. No matter how much they wanted it to go away. That conversation was one that would not be easily silenced. In the days that followed, Jamal's life seemed to stretch and contract in ways he couldn't quite grasp. The whirlwind of attention surrounding his incident had grown, spreading beyond his phone screen into every corner of the media. Local news outlets ran the story. The hashtag justice for Jamal trended on social media. It seemed that every news anchor, every columnist, every pundit had something to say about the event. But amidst the flood of opinions and headlines, Jamal remained calm, detached almost, as if the entire world was unfolding in front of him, an event he was simply watching. Not a part of. The surge of public support was overwhelming. But it didn't erase the unease in his chest. The quiet discomfort that gnawed at him. The issue had become bigger than he had ever expected. But it still felt deeply personal. People who didn't know him were rallying behind him. And that, in itself, was both humbling and strange. For a long time, he had lived in the background, moving through life unnoticed. And now, without warning, he was the center of attention. He wasn't sure if this was the kind of attention he had wanted. What did it mean for things to change if, after all the noise, people returned to their daily lives as if nothing had happened? What did it mean if the cycle continued, and Jamal was left holding the weight of a conversation that hadn't moved forward? Despite the growing support, there was still something unsettling about how the situation was being handled. People were demanding answers from the airline. But the apologies came swiftly. Too swiftly. The airline's representatives had issued a public statement, acknowledging that the incident had been mishandled, that the flight attendant had been suspended pending an internal investigation. But even as they expressed their regret, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another well-constructed performance designed to smooth things over. To put a quick end to the conversation. The words felt hollow, rehearsed. Jamal's phone buzzed again. It was another reporter, asking for a comment. He had already spoken to several. But the questions were starting to blend together. They all asked the same thing. What did you feel when it happened? What do you think should happen next? The questions were necessary, but they were also empty in a way. Like people were grasping at the surface of things without truly trying to understand what lay underneath. Jamal leaned back in his seat at the airport. waiting for his new flight to Chicago. It had been hours since he was escorted off the plane. He had already been moved to another gate. Another flight. The airline making sure all the details were taken care of. The logistics were fine. The flight was still going to happen. But everything else, the weight of what had transpired was still lingering. The public response was loud. People were calling for accountability. For a real examination of systemic racism in airline policies and practices. A few notable celebrities had spoken out in support, their tweets amplifying the message. But as the hours passed, Jamal began to sense that there was a subtle shift in the way people were beginning to treat the story. It was no longer the incident that had captured everyone's attention. It was Jamal. People weren't just interested in the injustice he had faced. They were becoming more focused on him, the individual, and less on the broader issue he had raised. There was a quiet discomfort in this realization, a feeling that the conversation was beginning to slip away from its original point. People were speaking of him as a hero. Yes, but were they really listening to the story he was telling? Or were they simply applauding the spectacle of it all? It wasn't that Jamal wanted to be seen as a symbol. He had never wanted that. But the longer this dragged on, the more it felt like his personal experience had become just another story in a long line of media narratives. Easily consumed and discarded once the next headline came. He glanced around at the other passengers in the terminal, their faces flickering in and out of view as they passed by. Each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own concerns. Some of them still hadn't spoken to him. But he noticed the way they looked at him now. The way they hesitated before meeting his eyes. Jamal wasn't sure if it was empathy or judgment they were offering. It was impossible to tell. He wasn't even sure how he felt about being seen this way. As an object of fascination or sympathy. There were times, in the past, when Jamal had felt invisible, like he was someone that people overlooked until it was too late. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was too visible. Like his identity, his entire existence, had been distilled into this one moment. And the world was picking it apart piece by piece. Jamal stood up, his movements deliberate, as he stretched his legs. The noise of the airport around him seemed to have grown quieter. The announcements over the loudspeakers blurred together, the voices indistinct. He walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the planes lined up on the tarmac, their massive bodies still and silent. He felt a strange kinship with them, as though, like him, they were waiting for something to happen, for something to change, for a direction to be set. As he stared at the planes, Jamal tried to center himself. The tournament was still ahead. He couldn't afford to lose sight of that. He would still compete in the chess tournament, still try his best, still keep pushing toward his future. That hadn't changed, and yet, he couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. The way the whole world seemed to be waiting for the next move. Waiting for him to lead them to the next conclusion. He hadn't chosen this fight. But now that it had become his, he wasn't sure what the next step was. He only knew that this wasn't the end. No matter how much people tried to make it so. This conversation, this question of what it meant to be seen, and what it meant to be treated as equal, had only just begun. And Jamal would not walk away until the world had no choice but to hear him. The plane touched down in Chicago a few hours later, its wheels skimming the runway with a smoothness that felt at odds with the storm of thoughts still swirling in Jamal's mind. He had spent most of the flight in quiet contemplation, reflecting on everything that had happened and everything that had yet to come. The whole situation felt like it belonged to someone else, a story he had only watched from the outside. Until it had suddenly pulled him in. Now, as the seatbelt sign flickered off and the passengers began to gather their things, Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of finality settle over him. He was here. He was at the tournament. The reason he had boarded the plane in the first place. The scholarship. The game. Everything he had worked for. He had done what he had come here to do. But the echoes of what had happened at JFK were still close by. Clinging to him. Wrapping around him in ways he couldn't shake. Jamal wasn't sure how the world would respond to his story now that he was no longer in the spotlight. Would they forget about him? Would the pressure fade, leaving only the memory of his actions, quietly tucked away among the many others that had come before? Or would things change? Would he see real progress? The air in Chicago felt different, cooler. Fresher yet it was hard to separate the weight of the past few days from the present. His phone buzzed again as he made his way off the plane. A familiar sound that had become a constant companion. It was a message from his mother. Checking in to see how he was doing. Remember why you're here. Focus on the game. But don't forget, you've already made a difference. Jamal smiled softly, tucking the phone into his pocket as he stepped into the terminal. The thought of the tournament made him feel grounded again. Something he hadn't realized he needed until now. The fight against injustice. The viral posts. The interviews, they had all been a whirlwind. But now, he was here for one thing. To compete. The chess tournament was already underway when Jamal arrived at the venue. He registered, the process feeling strangely routine after everything that had transpired. The hall was filled with the soft clicking of chess clocks. The quiet hum of focused minds. Jamal felt a strange sense of peace here. As if the chessboard was a place where things made sense. Where moves had purpose and consequences. And where, for a few hours, the world could fade away. As he sat down at his first table, the familiar weight of the pieces in his hands brought him comfort. His opponent, a tall young man from Ohio, glanced at him nervously, as if unsure how to proceed. Jamal's presence seemed to be acknowledged before the first move was made. Word had already spread. People had seen the story. Read the articles. He was no longer just a competitor. He was that Jamal Turner, the one who had stood up against the flight attendant. The one whose story had gone viral. But as the game began, Jamal pushed all of that aside. It didn't matter. What mattered now was the chessboard. His moves. His strategy. The only thing that could silence the noise in his head was the clarity of the game. The logic of each calculated move. The tournament was a chance to prove something else, something deeper than any public spectacle. It was a chance to prove to himself that he was more than the label the world had tried to place on him. He was a competitor, a student of the game, a young man with a future, not defined by any one moment. Hours passed in a blur of concentration and focus, his mind sharpening with each round. He played not just for the victory, but for the quiet strength that came from standing firm. From asserting that his presence, his very being, was as valid as anyone else's. As the day wore on, Jamal moved closer to the final round. With each victory, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Not just for the game, but for the battle he had fought in the world beyond these walls. After his final match, which he won in a close, tense game, Jamal stepped away from the table and walked into the lobby where reporters were waiting. They surrounded him. Their cameras and microphones aimed at him with the intensity of a story that had reached far beyond the confines of the tournament. They asked him questions, not about the game, but about his story, about what had happened in New York, about how he felt now that it had all played out. For a moment, Jamal felt the familiar weight of their attention, the pressure of their gaze. But this time, it didn't feel the same. This time, he was no longer just a passive participant in a narrative he hadn't chosen. He was part of a larger conversation. Yes, but one that had begun with his voice. And that felt different. He had chosen this. "I'm here for the game," Jamal said, his voice steady, calm. "I came to compete, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished. But I'm also proud of the conversation that's been sparked. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been dismissed, who's been overlooked, who's been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about us all standing together and saying, we're here, and we deserve to be seen." The reporters nodded, scribbling notes, their attention shifting toward his words. Jamal didn't know if they understood the depth of what he was saying. But it didn't matter. He understood it. That was enough. As the interviews wrapped up and he walked away from the crowd, Jamal felt a quiet sense of resolve. His journey wasn't over, not just in chess, but in life. The world hadn't changed overnight, and maybe it never would. But he had taken a step forward. A small step, but a step nonetheless. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. This wasn't just a story of one boy overcoming injustice, it was a story of all those small, quiet battles that, when fought together, began to reshape the world. And as Jamal walked away from the tournament hall, he knew that whatever came next, he would continue to play, continue to speak, continue to stand tall, not just on the chessboard but in life.